The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics welcomes you to Adding It All Up, a podcast created by and for mathematics educators and teachers. Join us each month as we explore current topics, insights, and emerging trends with thought leaders in the math community. And now, the hosts of Adding It All Up, NCTM President Latrenda Knighten and NCTM Past President Kevin Dykema.
Welcome back to Adding It All Up. I'm Kevin Dykema, current past president for NCTM, and with me as always is Latrenda Knighten, the current president of NCTM. We're so excited to dive into some crucial topics in math education today that impact both teachers and students alike.
Thanks, Kevin. We're really excited about today. We're going to have an opportunity to start talking a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, commonly known as the EIA, and how that relates to mathematics education. When I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, I often reflect on one of the joys of my job, my most recent job before being full-time president, was being able to visit teachers in their classrooms. And just as you watch your students mature and grow, I was able to watch teachers mature and grow. And I think about one teacher I had the pleasure of working with for the last 3 to 4 years and watching how in her classroom, it has just transformed from a room where everyone sat in rows and everyone did the same thing to when you go to visit Mrs. Brown's classroom, you see students actively engaged in multiple activities using a variety of strategies. And her classroom really is one that's inclusive, but is very responsive to the needs for each student to make sure they get an equitable experience.
I always love hearing stories like that, Latrenda, of classrooms that are making some innovative changes and meeting the needs of students. And that also reminds me, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit, the need to continually have these conversations around reimagining traditional high school pathways. And as we can think about, how math education has evolved, the rise of data science, statistics, other such courses really begin to offer students more relevant and engaging options.
I wish back in the way back time when I went to school that we were forward thinking enough to think about the idea of different pathways for different students. And it doesn't mean that we have different outcomes. Everyone is addressing those same grade level, high quality standards, but students have opportunities to think about their different ways to get there. And just personally, I have 4 siblings, and we are a lot alike, but we're a lot different as well, especially the way we learn and what we're interested in. And that really would have been a game changer, I think, if some of my siblings had different choices about what was the pathway that they chose. And luckily, I get to watch some of that happen with my niece and my nephew, who are teenagers, and I see how they've thrived when they were in opportunities where they got to make a choice, whether or not they chose a traditional pathway as opposed to an interest-driven pathway. So I've seen just the transformation in my niece and nephew when they had those choices.
And we know those interest-driven pathways are so important to provide opportunities for students to be successful and for them to see the relevance of high school mathematics and want to continue to take high school math. As I think about these new pathways, it also reminds me we need to continue to nurture a growth mindset in our students. As a high school student in the way back times, as you put it, Latrenda, I remember struggling with logarithms. I remember trying to memorize those rules, and it just made absolutely no sense at all to me. And there were times I'm sure I wanted to give up and say, math is no longer for me. But I persevered because I knew I wanted to be a math teacher when I was in high school. I thought, all right, I need to learn this in order to be able to get a job later on. But we need to help our students embrace those challenges and help them recognize through that perseverance that they'll make those good, solid connections. We have to help our students recognize it's okay that we get some struggle. It's okay that we get some setbacks. That's a normal part of that learning process.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, Kevin. you realized that you needed to persevere because you had an end goal that you knew involved mathematics. So you wanted to be successful. And it's great that you had that inner drive to do that, and probably lots of encouragement from your parents as well. So when I think about growth mindset, we know now how important it is that we foster that with students. But one of the things that we also want to be cognizant of is make sure that our educators have an understanding of what does that mean for students and how can they create environments that are welcoming to help students to actually foster that growth mindset. And when students get to maybe something that's a barrier, like those logarithms were for you, how do we help them to persevere? How do we change maybe a fixed mindset, especially for students who are not sure what they want to do when they leave high school? But we know that mathematics needs to be a part of their world. So I think it's great for us to think about those things and how do we help people with that.
So let's dive into these three areas a little bit more. And today we're going to be a little rebellious. Instead of Latrenda and I being the co-host and having a guest, we're going to switch roles here and we're going to become the guests and we're going to share some of our thoughts. So we've reached out to the community. We've reached out to our listeners to say, all right, what questions do you have for us? And today, NCTM's Associate Executive Director for Content and Professional Learning, Chonda Long, is here to take over as the host, and she's going to ask Latrenda and I some questions. Welcome, Chonda. We're so glad that you can take over the hosting duties for us for a little while.
Thanks, Kevin. I feel a little pressure now with this new
No
role.
pressure at all, Chonda. No pressure at all.
So as Kevin said, I'll be asking some questions based on topics brought up by the NCTM community. As I ask the questions, Latrenda, Kevin, either one of you can just jump in and answer. So let's just get started. So DEIA is increasingly central to discussions in math education. But what does diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility truly look like in the classroom?
So I'll start with that one.
See, we're so much better at the host role, Latrenda, because we know who's going to ask which question. We wait for our panelists to do it. And now the tides are turned and we're sitting and staring at each other on screen saying, all right, which one's going to talk first? It's hard to be on our role.
We're good with the script. Chonda, that is a great question. I wish that we had like this silver bullet or this magic wand that would say, this is what it looks like. And so you get your newest style magazine for teachers and you look at the pictures and you look for the guidelines and it's there. However, we do have some things that guide us and point us to what that should look like. So it starts, I think, first of all, with the leaders, meaning the teachers, the administrators, and the parents, because parents are students' first teachers. We have to think about how do we imagine that math environment should be. So then we're thinking about that community, because it is a community of learners, should be a welcoming place. It should not look just one way, because every child brings something from their past, from their previous experiences to the learning environment, to the classroom. So the first thing it needs to be is that students see an environment that is very diverse, that is accepting of them and embraces what they bring to the table. And so my lived experiences, my cultural beliefs, my experiences that I can build on to help me to be a mathematics learner. And by inclusiveness, that everyone feels as if they belong. And so it means that it doesn't look like one way. Shirley's classroom, all the students walk this way, they do this, they do that. This is a place where I know that I'm accepted for who I am. I'm allowed to think the way that I think. My teacher is going to honor that. And he or she is going to build on that and help me use that as a tool to learn in that classroom. And then when we think about accessibility, we're looking at all of those things to make sure that there's not anything that makes a barrier to the learning for a student. So there are some things that maybe are very explicit that you look for when you think about maybe students who have learning disabilities, and you make sure you take care of those things. But it could also mean, how's it accessible to a student who doesn't feel comfortable sitting in a traditional seat? Have I made some opportunities where I have alternative seating arrangements in my classroom so that I'm accommodating? Maybe you enjoy standing sometimes when you're working, having multiple grouping arrangements so that sometimes I get a chance to talk to others or try out my ideas with a friend. So I think about those things when I think about starting that learning environment. Kevin, what about you?
So, Latrenda, I think that was a great description of what DEIA can look like in the classroom. And when I think about in the classroom, I think it really starts with the educator in that classroom. That educator needs to have that firm belief that every one of their students in that classroom can learn. And I know in my classroom, if I have a student who I don't think can learn, I'm going to treat that student differently, whether I intend to or not. And we need to recognize that every single student in our classroom is bringing their own strengths. They're bringing their own unique set of talents, their own unique set of interests, their own background, their own culture. And it's the job of teachers, and it's a difficult job, to figure out what are those strengths, where are all of my students' brilliance, and to build on all of them. But I think it really begins with that teacher belief. If the teacher doesn't believe that all the students can learn, we need to have any more conversations about improving mathematics education continually. It starts with that teacher, they must believe. I think that also has implications then. If I believe that all students can learn in my classroom, I have to be willing to try different things. I have to recognize what works for some does not work for others. It worked for me, maybe, to sit in straight rows and just listen to the teacher talk and take notes and just memorize. That doesn't work for all of my students. For many of my students, I have to be willing to teach differently than I learned if I'm truly interested in meeting the needs of all of my students. I've got to be willing to take risks. I have to be willing to say, hey, just because I taught eighth grade for over 25 years doesn't mean that the year 3 should look like year 27. Year 10 should look different than year 15. I loved, Latrenda, that you brought up that, moving around and changing the seats and all that. My last few years before I became president, I was fortunate enough to be in a science lab. And I loved it because I had no bulletin boards, and I do not like bulletin boards. So it was a great joy for me to have a room with no bulletin boards. But just as importantly, if not more importantly, I had the nice little countertops all the way around the outside of the room. And for some of my students, that was their assigned seat. Now, on days that I was gone, they had a real seat where they had to go to. But I had kids that just sprawled out on the back because I knew that was the way that they were going to be engaged. That was the way that they were going to be able to fully participate in there. And that comes back to that welcoming, that diverse environment. And we just have to recognize we've got to be willing to try to do things differently if we're truly interested in meeting the needs of all of our students.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Latrenda. So my next question, how can educators foster a sense of belonging among students from all backgrounds, helping them to see themselves as mathematicians and encouraging them to pursue advanced math courses?
Yeah, and that's a challenge that comes down to learning who your students are and beginning to learn some of their background. One of the things that I tried to do was have a mathematician of the week, where I'd find a mathematician who looked like the students in my classrooms. And there's great websites that you can begin to do that because they need to see themselves as doing that. If I'm just showing the good old classical white dead males, my students who aren't white aren't going to see themselves in there. I want all of my students to see themselves in this world of mathematics and to recognize that math is useful. I think when we teach math as strictly a set of procedures to memorize, our students don't want to pursue additional math. But when I can get my eighth graders to that good, solid understanding stage, they want to continue to learn more math. So I think some of just sharing different, diverse mathematicians with them, people who do math for a career, and helping our students recognize that math is understandable.
And if I can add from my perspective, with most of my teaching career working with elementary students, I remember as a classroom teacher, even my very young kids, when you would say the word math, they had a certain connotation because they had older siblings or maybe their parents had said something. And so, in addition to introducing my students to leaders, they would think, oh, these are important people who looked like a lot of them, and just showcase those people as we would talk about things. One of the things that I found that was really important for me to do is to establish to them that not only were they mathematicians, but that mathematics was everywhere. And it wasn't just what they thought, it was like these little pages with just problems on them, and you just do a bunch of problems, and that's math because you're working with numbers. And so I found that we would do things like I'd come in and maybe I'd say, today we have a recipe and we're going to actually cook, so we're going to need to measure and make something. And it's like, you know what, you guys were just mathematicians and scientists. Then we'd go and visit our school cafeteria and talk to our cafeteria workers and have them show them the utensils they use and how they were related to mathematics. And so I did that because I thought early on I needed them to get a positive view of what math was. And maybe if I could hook them early, then they would begin to see themselves as mathematicians. And hopefully it would continue throughout their elementary years so they really could feel comfortable and safe and confident enough so they would get a strong foundation. But it really surprised me, probably my first couple of years teaching, that very little kids had these ideas of what math was. And so I found that just very rewarding for me. And it was fun to dream of all the different ways that I could show them how we use math in the real world. I found that helpful as well.
Thanks, Latrenda. Thanks, Kevin. So, NCTM has been vocal about promoting DEIA in math education. Can you share specific ways NCTM supports teachers and schools in advancing initiatives related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in math classrooms?
I guess when I think about the work that we do, of course, we have some publications that are explicitly about looking at equity and looking at diversity, like the impact of identity in K-8 mathematics, and now it's been expanded to K-12. But I think about Latrenda as that very beginning early career teacher going to an NCTM conference. And this is where the first time I encountered large groups of leaders and people telling me how important it was that every child in my classroom saw him or herself as a doer of mathematics, and actually showing me research based, research informed strategies and ideas to support that. Because while I believed it as an individual, at that time, I didn't have a foundation of, well, here's proof that this works, or here's something that other people have done, and this is why it works, or even knowing how to do some things to affect like my community outside of just me. Because it's fine for me in my classroom, but I need to be a force that shares that with people outside of there. So I would like to think that because it's always been an area of focus for us, we have very intentional practices. So that means that the professional learning opportunities that are afforded to us through the NCTM community keeps that focus on how are you thinking about all of your students? How are you thinking about making sure your students see themselves? How am I bringing the families in? And really thinking about the cultural richness that they bring to the table and how can they help support that. And one of the things that was life changing for me is when we published principles to actions and we had those 8 effective teaching practices as well as those 5 underlying principles. Those things really helped kind of tie it into, here's something I can keep my focus on. And then I feel as if when we took it up a notch and then we actually tied it into what does this look like as an equitable teaching practice? And then gave me like a set of bulleted ideas of how do you do this? And then here are some examples. Here are some scenarios from the classroom. So I had a picture of what that looked like. I found that that was really helpful for me. And around that time was when I transitioned to supporting other educators. So I felt it helped me to have those talking points to share with someone else, not just to say what happened in my classroom, but I had other examples. I had other resources to rely on. And I had something very tangible to give them strategies to help them to make a plan for thinking about those things.
In addition to the conferences and the publications you talked about, Latrenda, I think there are two other areas that NCTM has been vocal about and has continued to do work around. One of those is advocacy. The work that we do at the federal level, advocating for high quality math opportunities for every single student, not just for some, but for every single student, I think is one of those ways that we have a rich history and we continue to push forward. And I think the other one's a little bit more internal facing. I know Chonda asked about some of that a little more external. One of the more internal ones over the last couple of years, the board has really been focusing on what can we do to institutionalize it? What can we do to make it an everyday part of all of our conversations as we think about what's next for NCTM? So we contracted with an outside firm who was some specialists in this area. And over the last year or so, for internal purposes, we've created a narrative. We created some talking points. We're in the process of setting some goals of what do we want the council to look like. And we'll be starting to share those out with our committees so that it's not just the board having these conversations, but our committees that do so much of our work start to really implement some of these ideas in there. We're also going through and looking at all of our internal policies and procedures and making sure that we are recognizing all of our members in there and that we do have that focus on the DEIA in all of our policies and procedures.
Spring into 2025 with NCTM. Make your plans now to attend the NCTM 2025 Spring Conference, February 5th to 7th in Kansas City. Formerly known as the NCTM Regional Conference and Exposition, we've updated the name to better reflect the nationwide appeal of this highly anticipated event. View sessions and register today at nctm.org/KC2025.
Let's shift the focus of our questions. Let's talk a little bit about interest-driven pathways. So with the growing interest in alternative math pathways like statistics or data science, how do you think this shift might impact the overall goals of math education in high schools?
I think we've done a lot talking about, helping students see that they belong in this world of math. And yet for so many of our high school students, they get to high school, maybe before high school, but here the question was about high school, so we're going to focus on high school for a little bit. All of a sudden they start saying, wait a minute, what's up with all this content? When am I ever going to use any of this again for the rest of my life? And I think when we look at having interest-driven pathways for that junior, senior year, we're providing opportunities for students to want to take math. We're providing opportunities for them to see the relevance of mathematics. We provide opportunities with the statistics and data science for them to recognize, wait a minute, there's a lot of math in the world around me. Now it can begin to make sense of that. And I know we dive in a lot more to the pathways in our new publication that came out in September, the High School Mathematics Reimagined. And we really made that call as an organization, along with our colleagues from NCSM and ASSM, to be developing those interest-driven pathways to better meet the needs of every single one of our students. Latrenda, anything you want to add to why it's so important to have pathways at the high school level?
Yes. And again, it will be a little personal because I think about, I don't have personal children, but I have my niece and my nephew that I love very much. But just my former students. And I think about so many of the things that we know now about helping children learn and how keeping them engaged in mathematics so that they actually see how it's relevant to their world and having them think about, oh, I can use this pathway. I can study these things in math And that not only is interesting to me and my personal interest, but it's interesting to something I want to do in my future. And I remember just looking at some of the things like with gaming and how we have now students actually can get scholarships because they participate in those type of activities. And so when I shared a research article, and yes, it was a research article with my 16-year-old nephew, he got so excited that he texted me during the school day when he was at school because stopped and read the article and he was like, "Oh, yes, I believe that. I believe that." And I was like, my goodness, that's what we need. We want students to think about what is it they want to do, what their futures are they're thinking about, what are their interests, and how does math fit there, and really getting them engaged. And for some kids, they don't know what they're interested in just yet, but that gives us a greater chance of keeping them engaged, keeping them actually looking at opportunities for their future. And so I just saw just with Jordan, him finding out, okay, I do use this in the real world and I can't actually apply this to something that I may want to do in my future when I leave high school. That was enough to keep him interested enough to actually focus and want to graduate in the top 10 of his class. Whereas a year before that, he just wanted to get out of high school and go to college or whatever his mom told him to do, So I saw how that really changed his path.
Well, I think that's so important, Latrenda, and I'll share a story in a moment as well. But in Chicago, when we released the book at our annual conference, I was fortunate enough that my wife came along for the week, and she worked from the hotel room during the day. She snuck away from her work to listen to part of the rollout of High School Mathematics Reimagined, and I've had the opportunity to sort of eavesdrop on a couple of conversations that she's had with other people. And one of the things that resonated with her was that interest-driven pathways. And she noted that in her high school, everybody took the same high school senior level math. It was a very algebra rich course, which serves the needs of many students. Not all students are saying, oh, we don't need algebra. Many students need those algebra, those pre-calculus. But she was taking class with those that were going to be engineers, those that were going to be mathematicians. She was not going to be any of that. And what really struck her is when she started to think about, and when I pointed out in my president's address, let's look at language arts. Look at all the options kids have in that senior year. Let's look at all the options they have in their science, in their social studies. And I heard her tell her parents recently on the telephone, I wish I would have had those choices in math. Maybe I would have appreciated math a little bit more if I could take a statistics and a data science, something where I see that relevance of that. And we want to continue to have math for all students. We need to provide those opportunities for your nephew and your niece, for the other people's nephews and nieces, for their children to really hone in on what math could be necessary. Recognize that algebra is important for many, but for some, there are other pathways that are going to be much more relevant and much more important for them at this stage of life.
So some educators argue that students should be allowed to choose math pathways that align with their interests and career goals. How do we balance this flexibility with ensuring students still develop essential math skills?
One of the things I would say, Chonda, when we think about that, is it is rolled out so beautifully in High School Reimagined, Revitalized, and Relevant because we introduce our readers to 5 cross-cutting concepts. So these are themes that regardless of what pathway you choose, what course that you choose, these are themes that go throughout a student's entire high school experience. So you have that coherence, that connectedness that we're making sure that these things we've identified are so important that no matter what course of mathematics you're engaged in, you should be looking at it through that lens. So we keep that coherence. So we make sure that students are getting those foundational pieces. At the same time, we stress the importance of students being engaged and being introduced to mathematical and statistical modeling, because those are very relevant things. So the things connected to the real world. So there are 11 processes that we, again, lay out and expect to see those woven throughout a student's entire high school experience. So that's how you guarantee that students are getting the foundational pieces they need. They're getting the things that make connections to the mathematics they've had previously, to the mathematics they're learning now, and what they'll learn later. And then it also helps them to connect to things in the real world. And so by having those pieces in place, now we truly are having those equitable experiences for all students, because all students, regardless of the pathway they choose, get those foundational pieces to make those connections. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I think some of it depends on how are we defining essential math skills. If we're saying it's essential that all kids can solve a quadratic function, all kids can simplify rational expressions, you pick whatever isolated topic you want there, I'm not sure that's the experiences that our students need to be having. They need to be able to do those things. Let me be clear with that. But I'm not sure. I think in the past, we've focused so much of our energy on those, and we've lost sight of we need to be providing our students those rich experiences. And I love that you brought up those 11 mathematical statistical processes that are arranged around those 4 clusters. Those are the experiences that our students need to be having. It's sort of those habits of mind type of things, some of those soft skills. But really, when we think about the business and the industry world, they're not saying they want kids who are able to factor in a polynomial or can multiply 2 polynomials. They want students who are able to enter the workforce saying, hey, they can justify their reasoning. They can clearly communicate what they're thinking. They can work together with somebody. Those should be some of those essential math skills that we're focusing in on, not just those content-rich, math-specific type of things. It's some of those more broad things. And still making sure that our students are getting those good, rich content experiences. But I think in the past, I focused more heavily on the content and less on some of those developing some of those mathematical statistical processes. And I think we need to really emphasize more of those mathematical statistical processes, help our students recognize that they're capable of learning that math rather than just memorizing some random, we know they're not random, our students see them as random sets of procedures.
We're going to shift topics again. We're going to talk a little bit about math and growth mindset. So my first question for you on this topic, math anxiety is a significant barrier for many students. What strategies can teachers implement to help students shift from a fixed mindset, believing they're just not good at math, to a growth mindset?
That's a tough one. It's one thing just to tell the students, oh, you're capable of doing the math, but just telling a kid isn't enough. We have to match our words with some actions. And that means we have to be willing to try to do things differently. When I need to reteach a topic, if I'm just going to do it slower and louder, that doesn't send the message to the students that they are capable of learning math and they have that growth mindset. I think it's sharing stories of people in history of mathematics who have really wrestled with topics and have devoted years to understanding something. I think too often in the K-12 space, our students have this notion that if I don't get it after the first 7 seconds, I'm not good at math. And we know that somebody who is a pure mathematician, if we look at somebody who's a research mathematician or somebody who does mathematics for life, they can work for hours, days, weeks, years on a problem. And we need to be sharing those stories with our students and continually just trying new things, not just repeating it slower and louder, but truly trying things differently to help them recognize and then find those spots where they persevered and understood it and really praise the students, praise the class as a whole and point out, hey, look, you didn't give up. And now you've got a good, solid understanding of this.
And I love that, Kevin, because it's putting in that sweat equity into it, not just saying, oh, everyone can do this. It's all butterflies and unicorns, but we have to put some actions with it. One other suggestions I would give is engage in some time in your classroom or whatever your learning environment is to learn a little bit more about how your students learn and actually get them to tell you maybe an experience they've had previously that was positive, maybe one that wasn't quite positive, and to tell why. What were some things that happened that made you feel this way. And so it validates, their feelings that I believe in you, this is your belief. But at the same time, it can provide you with some ideas. What are some things, practices you can build into the classroom that help students to feel more comfortable? So if a student says, I learn best when I get to talk to someone else, can you build those experiences into those classroom activities? Really help students. I would tell them, let's dissect when you first started to think this way. What were the conditions that were happening that made this happen? Because if we can try to make those conditions not the conditions that's happening in the classroom at the moment. So, what are some things I can do to make you feel more comfortable? What are some structures I can put in place that are going to support you in this process? And so, again, that's validating who they are, their beliefs as an individual, them as a mathematician, and really, I guess, validating that everyone doesn't do it the same way each time. But I, as an educator, can make some changes to support all the learners in my classroom if I learn more about them and their learning styles.
Thanks, Latrenda. Thanks, Kevin. So I have one last question for you on this topic. How can we normalize mistakes and struggles as part of the learning process in math classrooms, especially in environments where students are often afraid to fail?
Yeah, and when I think about that, it comes back to the not just telling a kid you're capable of learning math. Here we can't just say it's okay that you're making a mistake. And I know that I've always told my students, I love when you're making a mistake. I love when you get something wrong. There's a lot of learning going on. What's my reaction when I make a mistake? If I say, oh, you guys, I'm so embarrassed. I can't believe I did that. What message is that sending to all of my students? So I think part of this normalizing making mistakes and normalizing struggle is the teacher being conscious of, hey, when you make a mistake, and let's face it, we all make a mistake as we're doing something. I had this weird habit of saying 8 times 9 is 72, but then I'll write 32 on the board, or I'll write 89, or put something totally different on the board. And the kids start laughing. If in that moment I say, I'm so embarrassed, I can't believe I did that, I'm really destroying that message that mistakes are valuable. I need to make sure that I'm sharing those stories with my students. I need to share that, hey, you all think I'm a math genius, but I wrestled. It took me a long time to learn this. It's okay if you don't have it perfectly after that first little bit. One of the other things I like to do with my students sometimes when they make a mistake is help them figure out what problem were you really solving. And for some of them, when they see the problem that they were really solving, they're like, oh, now I know what I need to do to solve the problem that you asked us to solve.
That reminds me of an activity I learned to do with my students to help some students feel more comfortable is let's take a look at maybe somewhere where we didn't quite get where we wanted to get to. So we didn't quite get to the end goal. And so what can we learn from this? Because we know from brain research that we learn more when our brains, maybe there's a little disequilibrium when we didn't get something 100% correct. So we learn from our mistakes. So how are we going to use maybe our mistakes or our errors to help us to learn more? And maybe even having students have like common misconceptions. And so how we take these problems and how can we find the mistake? So it almost becomes a challenge for students. How can I find out what was here? How can I explain it? And how can I find the strategy to help explain to someone, to this fictional student, how can you help them to correct their mistake? Or how can you help them to get back on the path towards the correct answer and things like that? And so, really validating that, you know what, I'm so glad you did that because I do that all the time, and that was one thing I would share with them. And sometimes also, is I would keep a journal just as my students kept a journal. And so I would show them like multiple attempts to do something so they would see that sometimes I use pictures or I had to write things out more than one time just to arrive at the place I needed to arrive at. So they really can think about how can I use what I've done, what I'm thinking about as a tool to help me to learn more, and just really how can I use my mistakes to help me, to grow, because God knows I would say all kinds of crazy things or whatever in the classroom. And it's like, that wasn't what I meant, but it just popped out of my head. So how are you guys going to help me? How are you going to teach me and coach me into doing that? And just, we're human. And so humans sometimes don't quite hit it a nail on the head. So how do we recover and move on from that?
I love that human part of that. And I think it's so important that our students see their teachers as human beings, and that we model that with our students, that it's okay to wrestle with something. It's okay to make a mistake with that. Chonda, I want to say thanks for being our special host for the day and jumping in and playing that role so that Latrenda and I could have an opportunity to be the guests on here. For our audience, if you'd like to submit questions to us for a future episode of Adding It All Up, please send us an email at president@nctm.org. Thank you for tuning in this month to Adding It All Up, and we look forward to connecting with you again next month.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Adding It All Up. At NCTM, we strive to bring you the biggest topics happening in mathematics. Join us next month for another exciting discussion.